Access Minnesota, issues that matter to you. Access Minnesota brings you the newsmakers and the stories that shape our everyday lives, with analysis from University of Minnesota faculty experts.
This month on Access Minnesota, we look at the past and future of Egypt. The treasures from one of Egypt's most famous leaders, King Tut, have come to Minnesota. We'll preview the Science Museum of Minnesota's latest exhibit, Tutankhamun, the Golden King and the Great Pharaohs. But first, we look at the political unrest that is happening right now in Egypt and across the Middle East. Access talked to Bill Beeman, a University of Minnesota expert on Mideast politics, about why these protests and demands for leadership changes are happening and what may be in store for Egypt in the coming years. Bill Beeman is the chair of the Department of Anthropology at the University of Minnesota. He has lived and worked in the Middle East for more than 30 years and is the author of several books and many scholarly articles. His most recent book is titled The Great Satan versus the Mad Mullahs, How the United States and Iran Demonize Each Other. Professor Beeman, welcome to Access Minnesota.
Thank you very much. I'm so pleased to be here.
The civil unrest in Egypt is reverberating across the Arab world. We've seen demonstrations in Yemen, Libya, Tunisia, Iran, and Bahrain. Are we witnessing a movement that is similar in some ways to the collapse of the Soviet bloc back in the late 1980s?
Well, that's a very good question. There is an important historical thread that ties all of these nations together. And that actually started in the 19th century when Britain and Russia more or less divided the Middle East into areas of influence for each other. And they were engaged in a very interesting kind of economic activity. They would create economic alliances with the rulers of the countries in these regions. And then the economic alliances would enrich the Europeans, and it would also enrich the rulers, but it left the people pretty much out of the picture. In the late 19th century, a very important figure, Jamal al-Din al-Afghani, started the Islamic movement to resist the Europeans and also to resist the rulers. And so what we're seeing today is actually 100 years later, more than 100 years later, we're seeing the same kinds of resistance, the same kinds of dynamics directed against foreign influence and against the rulers of these countries being played out in all of these countries. When Jamal al-Din was active, he actually missionized throughout the Middle East, from Morocco all the way to India, trying to spread this message. And one of the results of his missionizing was the founding of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is active in Egypt. But there are branches of the Muslim Brotherhood throughout the entire Middle East, and the question of the oppression of local rulers and their exploitation of their own population is a theme that every Middle Eastern country knows very well.
The unrest really began in Tunisia, although obviously the news has been focused on the chaos in Egypt over the past several weeks. Any reason why Tunisia was the flashpoint, and was there a trickle down from that point?
One of the reasons that Tunisia served as a flashpoint is because the Tunisian army essentially abandoned the government. And in other countries, like in Egypt, it was not all that swift an abandonment of the government on the part of the army, although there was a split in the army between the younger officers and the older officers. But the Hosni Mubarak in Egypt is himself a military officer, and so he has close ties with the military. And the military in Egypt has had a history of ruling the country in times of crisis. The last time in particular was in 1952, when the population kicked out the British-backed ruler, King Farouk. 2 years later, General Nasser, Gamal Abdel Nasser, came to power, also out of the military. And so there is a stronger relationship between support of the government on the part of the military in Egypt than there was in Tunisia.
How did the Egyptian protest start?
The Egyptian protest has been fomenting for many, many years. Mubarak has been in power for 30 years, and he's now 82 years old. He was trying very hard to install his son, Gamal, as the next successor to his rule, thus establishing a dynasty, really. Gamal was very, very unpopular in Egypt, and the economic conditions of the country are really quite drastic. The unemployment rate is very, very high. The population is very well educated, and young people in particular have not realized their career ambitions in any way. So when the Tunisian overthrow of the government took place, I think that this encouraged the protesters in Egypt to think that they could also overthrow their government and try to establish a more democratic institution.
The roots of the unrest, as you suggest, trace back to the days of colonialism, but I've heard a number of scholars point to the year 1979 as being very pivotal in the Middle East and having effects even today. The one event, of course, that many of us associate with 1979 is the Iranian Revolution. What other dynamics were in play in that year that may have helped to set up the forces that we see now leading to this unrest?
Well, before 1979, the United States, actually, we have to go back to 1972, really. This was when the British pulled out of the Middle East. They pulled their armed forces out of the Middle East, and the United States essentially moved in and took the place of Great Britain. This was during the Cold War, and Nasser had tried to reject Britain when he came to power in 1954, and so what Nasser did was essentially form an alliance with the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union was active in Iraq, they were active in Syria, and they were especially, they had been active in Iran after World War II. So the United States was really afraid that the Soviets were gaining on our influence in the region. And we threw our lot in, the military lot in, with the entire region in a very, very big way by supporting the Shah of Iran and also by supporting the King of Saudi Arabia. The Saudi Arabia and Iran were part of what we called the Twin Pillars policy. And the Twin Pillars policy was designed to try to prevent the Soviet Union from gaining a toehold in the Persian Gulf and thereby access to oil supplies and to a warm water port. So in 1979, the Shah, who had received military aid from the United States and all kinds of financial aid, was finally thrown out of office. He had used much of the support that he'd gotten from the United States to build up an army that repressed his own people. So the kind of dynamic that we're talking about here, where the the people overthrew a Western-backed government in 1979, was seen throughout the entire region as the first instance in which the native population had actually overthrown a ruler that was backed by a foreign power since the 19th century. So the Iranian Revolution led to the establishment of a Shia government with some very, very peculiar structures for the rest of the Middle East. And nobody is going to adopt a government like Iran's government. That's just really very strange even for the rest of the Muslim world. But the inspiration that came from the Iranian Revolution was noted by everyone, and they knew that if it happened once, it could happen again.
Access Minnesota will return after these messages.